So Kathy, we're looking forward to hearing how this has affected workers in the US and around the world. And so we'll just turn it straight over to you.
Great. Thanks so much. And good morning, good evening to those of us, to folks who are tuning in from Asia. Thanks to NPF. And Matt, it was great to hear your analysis, such an important piece of work. Indeed, over the past decades, the US and global labor movements have been talking about this very model that you've outlined, that it's a problem, that it's a model, a trade model that's been working for corporations, and it has not been one that has asked a fundamental question. Does this trade policy increase wages, which is one of the issues, bargaining power, and does it do any good for the environment? And so the more that we've been raising these questions, they tried to put the labor movement in a box. I think I liked your first slide. I would add some more terms. They would call us, are you anti-trade? Are you anti-globalization? And actually, none of that at all. The labor movement absolutely understands that workers are connected through supply chains. We need a functioning global economy that works for workers. But what has happened is that the rules that have shaped the global economy have continued to fail workers. And we've heard some of that analysis from you. And, one of the things that we've been spending time trying to think about is, what is the new model? What are the new policies? And I think the one thing we need to be doing is recentering the objectives of trade policy. Whose interests do they serve? Matt just identified, they serve the interests of elites in countries around the world, whether it's Germany, China. They are not serving the needs of working people in this country or around the world. And they're obviously not serving the need to protect our environment. So we need to fundamentally change the objectives of trade. And so, we need to start asking new questions, not are you free trade, are you protectionist? It is, what are the objectives of our trade policy? And do those trade policies benefit working people so that they can be part of the global economy? They can live lives with dignities. So that's what we have in front of us. And I think it's even more urgent because we're trying to think, how do we rebuild post-pandemic in a way that doesn't go back to the old normal, which wasn't good for working people, based on a neoliberal model that we see has failed over the past 40 years. So those are some of the fundamental questions. How do we shape this? Now, some people might think pie in the sky, right? Worker rights. We've been talking about this since marching in the streets of Seattle. Was there really ever consensus about having worker rights part of our trading system? Well, absolutely there was. If you look at some of the debates post-World War II about the multilateral trading system, Roosevelt and other leaders at the time understood you could not just cut tariffs. That was not all that you needed in a trading system. You needed to address the problems that came with this capitalist model. You needed some rules, some guardrails around worker rights, anti-monopoly provisions. You needed to build models that precisely would not increase trying to pit workers against one another. And back then, there was actually a charter called the Havana Charter that 53 countries signed on to, from the US, the Global South, and Europe. And there was broad agreement that you actually needed worker rights in the multilateral trading system. Now, folks won't be surprised. There was opposition from the business community to having the Havana Charter actually go forward. They didn't want worker rights. These are some of the same debates we've been having today, and we see what has happened. Now, so we know that there has been an understanding for a long time that one of the objectives of trade should be to address this issue around worker rights. Now, in the 1980s, you see a lot of changes happening in the trading system. Here in the US, you see Reagan, you see the PATCO strike, increased attacks on unions, the rise of the neoliberal model. And then you see this global system that is really based on a lot of labor arbitrage, on keeping labor flexible, on creating supply chains that are nimble, where you have a brand based in the US or Western Europe, and they no longer have any connection to their workers. And so, this whole model really gets us to the place that we are today, where we have a trading system that has continued to fail so many workers around the world, and it's not sustainable. And we're seeing real political implications. I want to take a second just to talk about the role of unions. Matt just talked about the need to grow bargaining power, but I always like to assume that people don't necessarily know why unions. What role do unions play in all of this discussion around inequality? If you don't have independent unions, like you do not have in China, that can bargain for the profits that come with increased productivity, then it is very hard to create shared prosperity in the trading system. Bargaining is one of the mechanisms. You have tax policy, you have other mechanisms for giving workers greater income, which is one of the things that we've identified, redistributing the wealth. And in the US, you see the problem that despite 68% of the population, kind of an all-time high, saying, we are positive about unions, we would like a union, we have labor laws that make it incredibly hard. And this is really the story in the majority of the countries around the world, except for Western Europe and some other places where they've created systems where unions are key partners. So in a country like China, when we talk about trade, what they have is the All China Federation of Trade Unions, which is it is not an independent union. Workers cannot bargain. They don't have the right to exercise their right to speak out about worker violations. And that is a real problem. That subsidizes, that creates a low floor in the global economy, which is, attempts to pit workers against workers, when in reality, it really is a frame that is helping corporations. So what about the China policy? I think that's front and center on people's minds. That's been a priority of this administration. We have to be clear that over the past decades, US policy toward China under both Democratic and Republican administrations has failed to ask that very question that I've been putting at the center. Does the policy work for workers? We've seen that since China began opening up in the 80s, how the Chinese model has been not only harmful to workers, but domestic producers as well. We've identified the problems for many years: currency manipulation, intellectual property theft, repressive worker and human rights, which all create an unfair playing field for the US to compete with China. We just cannot compete with a country that is using forced labor or has no independent workers movement, a model where there are state subsidies. We are coming to the table in a very different place. Let me just show you some of the numbers here. So we see the current situation with China and just the impact on jobs. We've got the trade deficit, which continues to rise. And at the same time, this administration that kept saying, we're going to get tough, we're going to, bring jobs back to the US, firms continue to invest $14 billion in China, which was a lot more than even in the first year of this administration. We've got massive job loss, most of them in manufacturing, but you also see job loss in electronics and computers. Just in the first 2 years of the Trump administration, you saw 700,000 jobs were lost. And the growing trade deficit, often there are, the states that people think about when they think about trade, but it really has cost jobs across the 50 states, and it has devastated communities of color. If you think of some of the places that have been hard hit by the closing of automobile factories, other manufacturing plants, this has had a huge impact. And obviously, this administration has, continues to say, we've got a new China phase 1 deal, and I want to talk a little bit about that because they said that this deal would really address some of these issues. Unfortunately, as we're seeing, the first phase did not use a new frame. We had the ambassador say that he was not willing to include worker rights even in the first phase of the China agreements, despite the fact the AFL-CIO and many of our allies raise this as a huge concern. They really failed to effectively address the root causes that account for the tension between our two countries, like subsidies, state-owned enterprise, overcapacity in sectors like steel. The phase 1 deal did focus on issues like e-commerce, financial services, intellectual property rights. And as we're seeing the numbers come out, and there's a lot of research even in these past few days showing that China has not lived up to its commitment. But the question again is, who has benefited? So if they're not buying more soybeans as we speak, or the trade imbalance is getting bigger and farmers and workers aren't benefiting, who is benefiting? And I think the answer to that question is clear, that the biggest winner has been Wall Street to date. One of the key issues about the phase one reopening of China was opening up financial services to the US banks. This, of course, has exposed, anyone with who's a federal worker and has a thrift savings plan, has exposed workers in this country to what it means to do investment in China. But that has really been the focus of this first phase. It's been a win for Wall Street. It's been, not very good for workers, for farmers. And so again, we need to ask, how are we going to reset this trade agreement, this trade relationship? And it is clear that despite everything we have tried to do, hoping when they enter the WTO that it would bring them into a rules-based system, it is very clear that the approach to China and trade has not been very effective. So what about worker rights? Matt mentioned a few of them. When you do not have an independent union, you cannot bargain, remember, for all the increased productivity that has been happening in China. There's a lack of benefits. There's long wages, long hours, wage arrears. We are witnessing the largest use of forced labor since World War II, since the Holocaust, in the Uyghur region of China, which is the Western region. U.S. brands have their supply chains there. So right now, Congress is looking at this issue because we have laws that protect us from importing goods made with forced labor. And so how is it that we are continuing to trade with a country that has forced labor, precarious health and safety issues, interns, anything to undercut sort of labor? Labor laws are ineffective. One thing that is interesting is when you don't have a way to channel your frustration, what we see time and time again in countries around the world is workers will stand up. And I'll show you the next slide. Is there are ongoing labor disputes. There's wildcat strikes. Some people may remember that image of the Honda workers stopping the supply chain and striking. And as Matt mentioned, there's nearly 2/3 of migrant workers have not signed employment contracts. So this is a subsidy. China is using egregious worker rights violations to really subsidize its economic model, its trade model. We know that when worker rights have been raised, President Trump himself has told Xi Jinping, don't worry about it, about the forced labor issue, about what's happening in Hong Kong. But we believe you cannot fix this trade model if you don't address these issues. And I just like showing, the reality, because I think often people hear, well, when there's not a union, what are workers doing in such a repressive place? And this image really shows you how courageous workers are in a very repressive place. They continue to stand up. They take enormous risks for themselves, and they have wildcat strikes, which means, they're not under the law. A group of workers decide to stop working. Withhold their labor to change the situation, get their wages, make sure they're working in safe working conditions.
So these numbers are the numbers on the circles are the number of strikes in that particular locale?
Correct. Okay. And there are just so many labor disputes. So, I always find it's important when we talk about, the closing of civil space in China, the repression of worker rights, that we also show that despite all of that, the courage of people to fight back and make sure they're getting paid, and that if they're going back after COVID, that they have health and safety protections.
And is the Uyghur region, is that the one in the little circle with the one in it in the far left?
So the Uyghur, it's all the way to the west, and the Uyghur region has the repression has really escalated since 2017. And one thing most people don't realize, those of us, with our cotton clothes on, that that region produces over 80% of China's cotton. And it's, we import more than 30% of our apparel from China. So one of the big conversations in the AFL-CIO is part of this coalition that has formed is we believe that, you know, US brands should not be locating their supply chains in this region until they can prove Customs and Border Protection that they indeed are not setting up their supply chains in a way that benefits from forced labor. You cannot have a global economy where forced labor is the floor. All workers from Germany to the US to Bangladesh will suffer if you are competing with forced labor. So just to get to some of the recommendations, because I know we want to have time to have a question and answer. What do we need to do? Where to with the sort of idea of changing the trade model? As I mentioned at the beginning, we need completely new trade objectives. We've heard the Biden-Harris campaign talk about, you know, taking a moment to really rethink our objectives so that they're centered on workers' well-being, protecting the environment. We need WTO reform. We don't have enough time to go into that today, but I would just say one of the issues is to include enforceable labor and environmental standards. You let China into the WTO, and there are no standards there that talk about labor and the environment. We need an enforceable labor mechanism in all trade agreements that not only hold governments accountable, which is the old model, but corporations as well. And in the new US, Mexico, Canada trade agreement, the labor movement worked hard to create a new model of an enforceable labor mechanism, which I'm happy to discuss. You need new labor and social protection laws. You can't get it all done with trade policy. Workers need good labor laws that protect them. We need new labor laws in the US. And you need social protection laws that guarantee that all workers have health care and protections, new tax policies. It's so ironic that you have this administration talking about bringing jobs back when what their 2017 tax cut did was create more incentives to offshore. You need transparency in negotiations and expanded participation of workers and stakeholders to help shape these policies. And lastly, we can't do it alone. We must rebuild alliances. We have to rebuild our diplomatic efforts. We cannot think that you know, we are in this zero sum, this framing of actually trade wars I push back on, because that's absolutely not what we want. We need alliances. We need a global economy that functions for workers everywhere. Thank you so much.